Hey everyone, welcome to episode 13 of Learning with Leary, presented by TheFloatLife. I'm your host, Jake Leary, and today Jeff and Bodhi are joining me so that we can talk about your body position on a one wheel. We have three different perspectives on what the ideal body position is for accelerating and for cruising at a steady speed on a one wheel. But what we're all looking for is to ride in an athletic stance that allows you to maintain balance, react to bumps, swerve and turn easily, be able to brake quickly and steadily, avoid nosedives, and be able to mitigate the damage if a nosedive does happen. We're not looking at trick riding or racing technique where you're pushing 25 miles an hour. We're really just looking at how to ride safely, avoid overwhelming the motor, and help reduce serious injuries. So now let's kick it over to Jeff.
What's up everyone, I'm Jeff and welcome to my TED Talk. Today we're going to cover a bunch of different stuff. The main focus though is going to be nosedives, why they happen, how to prevent them, what to do if they do happen, sort of all the different options, and it'll get you guys ready to rock and roll. We're going to talk a little bit about how I like to ride, my personal preference. Again, everyone rides totally different, so what works for me might not work for you. That's why we also have Bodhi and Jake explaining their styles. First things first, something that I feel like gets beat to death, but no one's ever really explained it in a super palatable way, is nosedives and why they happen. One wheel, the way that it works is you have the motor, and the motor has two jobs. Job one, keep you balanced. Job two, make you go faster. It only has a certain amount of energy in order to accomplish both of those tasks. Let's say, for example, there's 100 units of energy. Call it the kilowatt hour, call it horsepower, whatever you want to call it. 100 units of energy in that one wheel motor. If you're riding slow and that motor's not using all that energy to make you go faster, it can use almost all of that energy to keep you balanced. So let's say you're going 5 miles an hour. You can ride really, really sloppy, body position all over the place, cranking left and right. It doesn't matter because the one wheel is going to be able to keep you balanced because all those units of energy are able to be used to keep you balanced because they're not being used to make you go faster. So if you're riding super heavy on the nose at 5 miles an hour, probably fine. 10 miles an hour, probably fine. 15 might start to get a little sketchy. 20, too heavy on the nose. That nose is going to give out because that power is being taken away from being able to keep you balanced and being thrown into making you go faster. Now that's not 100% of the nosedives. Every once in a while there's a mechanical failure, but that's super, super rare. Almost every single nosedive is typically user error, leaning too far forward, too much weight on the front. Motor can't keep you balanced anymore because it's using all of its bandwidth to make you go faster. Okay, so what are your options if you're gonna nosedive? In my eyes, you have two options. Option one, run it out. Option two, save it and ride away. I think you're going to be better off if you leave both of those options on the table and you ride with a certain body position where they're both still going to be viable options when that nosedive does hit. Because if you end up riding in a body position that only allows you to run it out and not to save it, that really limits your options. If you ride in a body position that only allows you to save it, but you can't really run it out, limits your options again. So I like keeping both options on the table. So I try to ride in a body position where if I choose to, I can try to save it. If that's not gonna work, I can get a safe run out on it or at least get a couple steps into a roll. And I think that's super important too, is to be able to get a couple of steps before you roll. Because if you just go straight into a roll, that's a lot of force going into your shoulder, into your collarbone, into your upper body. It's not good. If you can get a couple of steps and change your trajectory from straight downward to sort of more of a horizontal trajectory, you're gonna be safer off in the end. So let's say a nosedive is happening to you right now, and you're actually riding with your hips a little too far forward. What I think is going to happen when your hips are a little too far forward is you're not going to be able to save it very easily because so much of your weight is over that front and you're in a weird, awkward body position. So it's tough to throw your hips back, get low, and actually save the nosedive. But with your hips a little further forward like that, when the nosedive does happen, you're in a better position to get your feet under you and start running it out. And then on the other hand, you have riding with your shoulders too far forward. If you're riding with your shoulders too far forward and your nose digs in, now all of a sudden all your upper body weight is so far forward that by the time you nosedive, there's no way you're gonna be able to run it out, and it's gonna force you into the ground super quick, and you're gonna be turned into that roll a lot quicker than you would like to. So it's a lot harder to run it out if your shoulders are too far forward. All right, so what is the best body position, in my opinion, to be in when riding a Onewheel if you're looking for safety, speed, and as many options as possible if the nose does dip down into a nosedive? So for me, it would be like this. I have my front leg, I got it nice and bent. I got my back leg a little bit stiffer, a little more straight, and then I have my hips actually a little bit in front of my wheel. So that's where I get my forward weight, my forward momentum in order to accelerate or at least maintain speed by getting a little bit on the nose in front of the wheel. But then I have my shoulders either in a straight line up from it or just a touch back. So that counterbalances the hips and keeps me in a really nice centralized position. And then I like to keep my arms up for good balance too, because your arms are super easy to throw around. It doesn't take a lot of weight or energy to throw your weight around with your hands. So I like to keep those up for a nice little balance point right there. And then if nosedives do happen from that point, I'm not in a weird position to where I can't run it out or I can't save it. I still have both those options on the table, and I can make that decision as soon as it happens. Whatever happens in that split second, I'm covered. That's it. That's how I ride. That's what's most comfortable for me. And let's see what Bodhi's got to say. Float on, my friends.
My name's Bodhi. I love the Onewheel. Today, I want to join this conversation with Jeff and Jake about how we feel the safest riding position is and the way we personally like to ride our Onewheels. So let's just jump right into it. Me, myself, when I'm cruising, when I'm riding around, I'm a little bit haphazard on my riding style. So if you watch me ride, I'm kind of all over the place for two reasons. Reason one being I've been a board sport athlete since before I could think, so it's very in tune into my body to be able to recover and manipulate my body in certain ways, so I'm able to be a little more loose about it. And two, I don't care if I fall. I care a little bit, but I'm very good at falling from what I've done for my entire life. So I'm good at falling, so falling isn't constantly running through my head, so I'm able to just kind of be a little looser, a little more stylish. So you kind of see me all over the place. But if you put me down, you're like, yo, what's the safest way to ride? If you had to pick your position, if you had to tell me how to ride, what would it be? And this is the position that I ride in when I feel unsafe, or the terrain is gnarly, or I'm trying to go fast, or I'm in a race. This is how I stand to be utmost safest on my Onewheel, in my opinion. Now, I keep it pretty simple. I have basically one rule because I feel like there's kind of room to find your own position, to find your own place. But this one rule is what I keep front and center in my head, which is never let your shoulders go past your tire. And if they do go past your tire, be very aware of it and don't let it go too far. Because, like Jeff has mentioned before, and I love the way he breaks it down, the board only has so much power to keep you up. So if you get that weight too far in front of the board, you're going to slam. So the best way to not get that weight too far in front of your board is to use your hips to accelerate while keeping your shoulders and head back. Using your hips is the best way to go about throttling your board, in my opinion, because it allows you to keep this big old chunk of weight up here. You know, your head, your pectorals, your shoulders, your arms, this whole chunk of your body is a lot of weight. And when you use your hips to accelerate, it allows all that weight to stay back over the tire of the Onewheel, keeping the balance of the board nice and centered and nice and stable. Because you have to tilt the board to accelerate it. And I believe you basically have two choices. You get to use your hips and your knees, or you use your head and your shoulders. Because at the end of the day, you have to accelerate the board some way or another. And I believe hips are the best way. Because if you think about it, you're basically a big stick with a big old weight at the top of it, and your board is kind of like a spring. And you're kind of sitting on it like a metronome. And that spring can hold you up to about here, hold you up to about here, and this is the safe zone. But if you lean that weight too far forward, the spring can't keep that weight, that top heavy weight up anymore. It just bloop, falls over. That's a nosedive. I myself do a lot of tricks. I do a lot of riding really fast. I have some fast friends that I like to try to keep up with. Shout out Neil and Austin, you guys are way fast. And I love to do radical maneuvers on the Onewheel and figure out what's possible and push myself and hurt myself. And What's at the center of my mind, where all my brain calculations are coming from, is keeping my shoulders and my head over my tire and keeping my hips as what's maneuvering my board, what's braking my board, what's accelerating my board, what's turning my board. That's what's going on in my head, is keeping this big chunk of weight over the tire and using this nice centered low gravity weight to shift around, to recover, to accelerate, to slide, to balance. Like, it's all in the hips, and that's what I tell everybody. That being said, there are extremes to both the shoulders and the hip argument, and they're both bad. I made a little infographic. Here we have the extremes of both, right? The extremes of using your hips is not good. If you're in a giant C formation in either direction, C's are not good. If you're in a C formation, hips way out forward, head way back, if your nose goes down, you're in just such an awkward position like that there's no way you can run anything out. Now on the other side, the shoulders, having your shoulders way far forward, being in a C position towards the front, is almost always going to go bad. If there's any kind of incline, you punch the throttle a little bit too hard, you hit a bump, that's how you end up on your face or just flying off the front of the board. So the extremes on either side put you in awkward, crappy positions where there's pretty much no way you'll recover. So it's good to focus on being in a nice centered position, keeping the head right above the wheel and keeping the hips just in front of that head and that wheel being your weight control, your throttle per se. So like I wrote here, lead and accelerate with your hips. Keep your shoulders behind hips and above the tire is my perfect riding position because it keeps you nice and centered, keeps that top heavy weight right over the top of the wheel, just using those hips to poke forward just a little bit to get that weight out in front of yourself. Now, the most important thing is just being in a position where if a nosedive were to occur, that's the position you want to be in. Find that position, live in that position, ride in that position. And as you get more comfortable riding, you don't really have to focus a ton on that because it almost comes second nature. But it's really important at the end of the day to find the position that you want to be in when stuff goes south. So that's it. That's my opinion. That's how I think you should ride. That's how I ride. And speaking of riding, I'm going to go ride. So let's hear what Jake has to say. Have a great day. I love you all.
I have a controversial opinion on this topic because I believe that the most important body part to keep back behind the wheel is the hips, and that the hips are by far the most dangerous body part to push forwards. I want to start by pointing out that balance is different when you're moving than when you're standing still. When I'm standing still, I keep this stick balanced by keeping it straight upright. But when I'm accelerating, and even when I'm cruising at a steady speed, I need to keep the stick at a diagonal to stay balanced. So when you're riding on a one-wheel, try and imagine this line, this axis of balance, coming up from the center of your tire, and use that as a guide of where to keep your body. But your body is not rigid like a stick. Standing tall when you ride is a good way to conserve energy, but bending your knees and getting lower to the ground is essential for handling bumps in the road and staying alert and safe. Your knees hinge your thighs back, and your hips mainly hinge your torso forwards. I say mainly because when you stand up straight, you're very close to the extreme of how much your hips can hinge back, but you have a lot of room to hinge forward. Putting your hips in front of your shoulders is one of the worst things you can do to maintain an athletic stance. If you look from the side, the body is really good at hinging into this S shape because it's natural to hinge forward at the hips. This position helps you get low to the ground in a way that is stable and allows you to easily move in any direction. If you were to ride facing directly to the side, then you should have this S shape when looking from behind. But from the side perspective, your default riding position should avoid jutting your hips out in either direction and keep your spine directly on that imaginary diagonal line. This means that your head is noticeably in front of your hips when accelerating and even slightly in front when you are just cruising at a steady speed. But most riders face their bodies forward to some extent. I recommend you ride with your front foot angled forward. hips angled forward and shoulders angled forward so that you can look where you're going. And when you put your body in an S position when facing forward, your spine should be at even more of a forward angle than if you were to ride facing your body to the side. This is why braking is most effective with your hips, and this is just one reason of many why you should not ride with your hips in front of your chest. If you ride with your hips forward as your default position, you put yourself into an awkward C position instead of a robust S. You should only put your body into a C shape or banana position as a last-ditch effort to rebalance when you're not worried about falling. If you stack your hip directly on top of the knee, you're keeping your hip as high as possible off the ground, which makes your center of gravity higher, which makes it harder to balance. You are also keeping your hip joint near the extreme of its range of motion, which also makes it harder to balance because one of the most critical aspects of balance is to be able to move any body part in either direction easily. Staying somewhere in the middle of the range of motion is not just essential for balance, it's also essential for suspension. By maintaining the S shape, you ensure that your whole body will act as suspension almost automatically and retain an athletic position even as you get lower to the ground. Good suspension needs to work in both directions. If you ride in a C shape, you start higher off the ground and you make it harder for yourself to get low. Now, the three of us all agree that the best way to brake and save a nosedive is to get the hips down and back. The question is, what position should you ride in to make getting to this position the easiest? I say with your hips back, because all you have to do to brake or slow down is just let gravity take over. When you're standing, you're using your muscles to fight gravity, but it's way easier to go with gravity than against. Here's a video of someone riding with his shoulders extremely far forward, way more than I would recommend. He doesn't even realize that he's nosediving until after it happens, and he's fine because his hips were back. Riding with your hips in front of the wheel is much more dangerous because you have to move them farther to get into your braking position, and so it takes more time to get there. Now let's say that you nosedive and you don't realize that you've nosedived until your body is already flying off the board. The best position to be in here is where you can run, and if you can't run, roll. If your board stops, some or all of your body needs to continue forward, and your shoulders have way more room to go forward than your hips do before they cause a fall. Even if you ride with your torso at a 45-degree angle, which is way further forward than I recommend, you still have a whole 45 degrees before your torso is parallel to the ground, at which point, even if both of your shoulders are past your front foot, you can still keep running. The stopping force of a nosedive is coming from your feet, so it will naturally affect your hips before it affects your shoulders. The best way to prepare for your feet stopping is to push your hips back. Now, some of you may say, I can't run it out, I don't want to run it out, it's safer to roll. And if you need to roll, you also want to lead with your shoulders and not your hips. If you remember episode 3 on how to bail, a proper forward roll involves getting your hands to the ground first, then your shoulder, and then your opposite hip. Shoulders go forward, hips stay back, and then a nice roll from shoulder to opposite hip. If you're falling forward and you land with your hip before your shoulder, it's going to be more of a splat, and your torso will be more likely to bounce off the ground than to roll. In this clip, Robert saves a nosedive by getting his hips back and shoulders forward. In this clip, you can sort of see his buddy save a nosedive in the exact same way. And in this clip, he doesn't really get his hips back, his torso is very upright, and since his hips hit before his shoulders, he can't roll properly, instead he goes splat. That's it for the bails. Here, Elijah lands and his tail unexpectedly goes down, which slows his tire and his feet and causes his hips to jut forward and puts his body into a C shape. But he immediately corrects the mistake and straightens out his spine and puts his head and shoulders in front of his hips. Putting your hips in between your head and the ground is not a good way to keep your head off the ground if it means putting your body into a C shape, because it puts your body in a less athletic stance, makes it harder to balance, harder to use your body as suspension, harder to brake, harder to ride out a nosedive, harder to run out a nosedive, and more likely that if you do fall, that you will go splat instead of rolling properly from shoulder to hip. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. This is the last episode of this season of Learning with Leary. I'm going back to New York for a bit, and while I'm there, I hope to have time to make some videos on commuting safely in traffic on my personal YouTube channel. Until next time, float on, my friends.
Oh, you stoked to go ride? I'm stoked to go ride. I'm gonna go ride. You should too. But if you're not, definitely subscribe to our channel or check out one of these two videos. I'm gonna go get my shred on.